The Aegean Sea was burning. In the late summer of 490 BCE, the greatest amphibious invasion force the ancient world had ever seen moved methodically across the water, systematically erasing cities from the map. 600 transport vessels and warships blackened the horizon. Tens of thousands of infantry, archers, and cavalrymen sat packed upon the wooden decks. This was a logistics train of unimaginable scale, commanded by King Darius of Persia with a single, absolute objective. He did not come to negotiate borders or exact mere tribute. He came to execute the total annihilation of Athens. This was not an army. It was an apocalyptic force of nature, a mechanical empire that consumed everything in its path. Just days before, the storm had finally broken over the island city of Eretria, Athens' closest ally. The Persian war machine surrounded the walls, unleashing a relentless, suffocating siege. When the city's defenses finally collapsed, the destruction was absolute. The ancient temples were looted and torched, the columns collapsing into ash. The men were slaughtered in the streets. The women and children were dragged from the rubble, chained together by the neck, and herded into the holds of the Persian transport ships to be sold into the darkest corners of the empire. As the thick black smoke from Eretria drifted across the narrow strait and darkened the skies over the Greek mainland, the terrifying reality of the empire finally arrived on the shores of Attica. The Persian armada was no longer a distant rumor or a political threat. The fleet was turning south. The shadow was moving over the water. The target was Athens, and the survival of the Western world was suddenly reduced to a matter of days. Inside the walls of Athens, the air choked with panic and the bitter smell of distant ash. The city was unraveling. The terror of the advancing fleet was compounded by a deeper, more insidious paranoia, tearing the citizens apart from the inside. Athens was a young, fragile democracy, still deeply scarred by decades of aristocratic tyranny. As the Persian ships drew closer, the streets filled with frantic mobs, dragging carts of grain and hoarding weapons, looking over their shoulders at their own neighbors. The true fear paralyzing the city was not just the overwhelming numbers of the Persian infantry. It was the terrifying certainty of treason. The former Athenian tyrant, Hippias, was sailing with the Persian fleet, promising wealth and power to any aristocratic faction willing to betray the democracy. Every night, the citizens stared at the heavy wooden gates of the city, terrified that a sympathizer would unbar them in the dark. In the shadow of the Acropolis, the 10 generals of the Athenian army stood deadlocked in a suffocating political crisis. The council was split directly down the middle. 5 generals demanded that the army remain behind the high stone walls and endure the coming siege, terrified to face the Persian cavalry on an open field. But the other 5 knew the brutal truth. Athens was entirely unequipped to survive a prolonged strangulation, and a siege would inevitably breed the very treason they feared most. The stalemate hung over the city like a death sentence. The entire fate of the Greek world rested on the shoulders of one man, the polemarch of Athens, Callimachus. He held the deciding vote. The pressure on him was crushing, a historical burden that could end in the enslavement of his entire civilization. It was then that Miltiades, a seasoned general who had intimately studied the Persian war machine, cornered Callimachus. Miltiades understood the fatal flaw of waiting. He argued with cold, terrifying logic that if they remained trapped inside their own walls, the city would rot from fear before the Persians ever fired an arrow. They had to seize the initiative. They had to abandon their homes, march out into the open, and plug the only viable coastal road the Persians could use. Callimachus broke the deadlock. The army would march. The forced march out of the city was a grim, silent procession. 10,000 Athenian citizens, farmers, potters, blacksmiths, and merchants strapped themselves into heavy bronze armor and left their families behind, knowing they might be looking at their homes for the final time. They marched northeast through the rugged hills, feeling the agonizing heat of the late summer sun baking the metal on their shoulders. When they finally reached the high, rocky ridges overlooking the coastal plain of Marathon, the sheer scale of the nightmare below them came into full, terrifying view. The bay was entirely choked with the wooden hulls of the Persian armada. The shoreline had been transformed into a sprawling, temporary city of thousands of canvas tents, supply dumps, and tethered horses. The Persian army, numbering roughly 25,000 men, moved like a restless ocean across the flat ground. There were lines of light infantry, elite immortals, and devastatingly mobile cavalry units, all waiting to push inland. The Athenians halted on the high ground, dropping their heavy wooden shields into the dirt. The geography of Marathon was a natural choke point, flanked by impassable mountains on one side and treacherous, muddy marshland on the other. If the Persians wanted to march on Athens, they had to go through this narrow corridor. But looking down at the vast disparity in numbers, the Greek hoplites felt the cold dread of reality sink in. The stalemate began. For days, the two armies simply watched each other. The psychological torture of the standoff gnawed at the Athenian ranks. Every morning, the Persians paraded their cavalry across the open plain, a calculated display of speed and lethality designed to break the Greeks' nerve. The Athenians were trapped in a claustrophobic waiting game, unable to retreat but terrified to advance. Then, out of the mountain dust, a sudden wave of bronze appeared on the road behind them. 1,000 soldiers from the small allied city of Plataea marched into the Athenian camp. It was a profound, defiant gesture of loyalty. They knew the odds were suicidal, but they chose to die beside Athens rather than face the empire alone later. It was a brief, desperate surge of hope in an increasingly hopeless siege. That fragile hope was shattered just days later. The Athenian runner, Phidippides, finally returned from his agonizing 240-kilometer sprint through the harsh Peloponnesian mountains to Sparta. His feet were torn, his lungs burning from the sheer physical destruction of the journey. The message he carried was a death knell. The Spartans, the only professional military force in Greece capable of matching the Persians, were not coming. They were bound by the absolute, fanatical rigidity of their religious law. The festival of the Carneia had begun, and Spartan doctrine strictly forbade their army from marching until the moon was full. They would not break their sacred laws, even if it meant the entire Greek world burned to the ground. The void of isolation settled heavily over the Athenian camp. They were completely alone. The generals stared down at the vast Persian encampment, knowing they could not maintain this stalemate forever. Their supplies were dwindling, and the fear of treason back in Athens grew more intense with every passing sunset. Then, the geometry of the battlefield suddenly shifted. Athenian scouts, stationed on the lower ridges, noticed a frantic, highly organized movement near the shoreline. The sprawling Persian cavalry camps were being dismantled. The massive war horses were being led up the wooden ramps and loaded deep into the holds of the transport ships. Datis, the Persian commander, had grown tired of the standoff in the mud. He was pivoting his strategy. By loading the cavalry and a large portion of his strike force onto the ships, he intended to sail around the Attic Peninsula and strike directly at the undefended gates of Athens. The window of opportunity opened with terrifying speed. Without the Persian cavalry to flank and slaughter the slow-moving Greek infantry on the open plain, the hoplites suddenly had a fighting chance. But it meant they had to attack immediately. Miltiades moved ruthlessly through the command tents, forcing the order to advance. There was no time for debate. If the ships launched, Athens would fall. The trap had to be sprung. The order echoed down the ridgeline. 10,000 Greeks began strapping on their heavy Corinthian helmets, plunging themselves into a suffocating, terrifying sensory deprivation. The bronze casings restricted their breathing, cut off their peripheral vision, and muffled the sounds of the world into a dull, echoing roar. Each man hoisted a massive oak and bronze shield, the aspis, onto his left arm, and gripped a long ash spear in his right. They were carrying over 70 pounds of dead weight under the glaring sun. Miltiades made a desperate, calculated adjustment to the battle line. To prevent the massive Persian army from wrapping around his flanks and slaughtering his men from the sides, he stretched the Greek formation dangerously wide. He packed the wings with his heaviest, most experienced fighters, but he deliberately thinned the center to a fragile, brittle depth. It was an invitation for a breakthrough, a suicidal gamble that relied entirely on the wings crushing the enemy before the center completely collapsed. The Greeks stepped out from the tree line and began their descent toward the flat expanse of the plain. Below them, the Persian archers, thousands of men armed with powerful composite bows, calmly notched their arrows, waiting for the heavy infantry to enter the kill zone. The kill zone was a vast stretch of open dirt, a mathematical certainty of death for slow-moving troops. Then, the Athenians did something that defied all military logic of the ancient world. They broke into a sprint. The sheer biological agony of running at full speed while encased in bronze tore at their lungs and burned their thighs. The sky above them suddenly turned black. A massive, hissing cloud of wicker-shafted arrows blotted out the sun and plummeted toward the charging line. The acoustic trauma of the barrage was deafening. Arrows smashed into the bronze shields, shattered against the heavy breastplates, and rained down on the helmets like a violent hailstorm. But the thick Greek armor held. The hoplites kept running, their eyes locked on the Persian line through the narrow slits of their helmets. They were closing the distance violently fast, robbing the archers of the time they needed to unleash a second, devastating volley. The gap narrowed to 50 yards, then 20, then 10. The collision was a catastrophic release of kinetic energy. 10,000 heavy bronze shields slammed into the lighter, wicker-shielded Persian front line with the force of a collapsing wall. The sound of shattering wood and screaming men echoed across the plain. This was the othismos, the brutal, claustrophobic push of ancient hoplite warfare. The lighter Persian infantry, lacking the heavy armor to withstand the crush, were instantly trampled under the sheer forward momentum of the Greek charge. Spears splintered, and the battle devolved into a suffocating, horrific melee of short swords, shield bashes, and desperate gouging. The dust, kicked up by thousands of struggling feet, formed a thick, choking cloud that blinded the men inside the crush. But in the center of the battlefield, the dynamic violently shifted. The Persian center housed their elite shock troops and the heaviest infantry of the empire. As they absorbed the initial impact, they began to push back. The deliberately thinned Athenian center started to buckle under the overwhelming pressure. Greek soldiers were forced to step backward over the bodies of their own dead, their boots slipping in the blood and mud. The line was bowing inward, dangerously close to snapping. If the center broke completely, the Persian horde would pour through the gap and roll up the entire Greek army from behind. It was a terrifying, agonizing retreat, but Miltiades' gamble was playing out exactly as the bloody geometry demanded. On the extreme left and right flanks, the heavily stacked Greek wings were annihilating the lighter Persian levies. The Persian flanks began to disintegrate in sheer panic, men dropping their weapons and fleeing toward the ships. Rather than breaking formation to chase the retreating flanks, the disciplined Greek wings executed a flawless, devastating maneuver. They stopped, pivoted their massive shield walls inward, and marched directly toward the exposed sides of the elite Persian center. The vice slammed shut. The Persian center, moments away from breaking the Greek line, suddenly found itself being crushed from three sides simultaneously. The psychological shock of the double envelopment shattered the Persian resolve. The formation dissolved into absolute chaos. The retreat became a frantic, desperate rout toward the safety of the sea. The Greeks pursued them without mercy, driving thousands of terrified Persians into the deep, treacherous mud of the marshes where they drowned or were speared in the back. The slaughter continued all the way into the surf, the water turning violently red as men fought and died clinging to the wooden hulls of the launching ships. The adrenaline finally crashed, leaving the surviving Greeks standing in the bloody surf, their lungs burning and their arms numb from the slaughter. The beach was littered with thousands of Persian dead. The impossible had happened. The heavy infantry had broken the empire, but there was no cheering. There was no time to rest or mourn the fallen. As the dust settled over the bay, a scout pointed a trembling finger toward the southern horizon. The surviving Persian ships, carrying the bulk of the untouched cavalry and thousands of reserves, had pulled away from the shoreline and caught the wind. They were not retreating to Asia. They were sailing directly around the peninsula toward the undefended gates of Athens. The crushing, horrific realization washed over the blood-soaked hoplites. The victory on the beach meant absolutely nothing if the Persian fleet reached the city first. The women, the children, the entire future of their civilization was entirely exposed. Miltiades screamed the orders over the roar of the surf. The army had to turn around. The true climax of Marathon was not the battle. It was the agonizing 26-mile forced march back to the city. It was a test of sheer biological endurance that pushed the human body past the limits of sanity. The men marched in the blistering heat of the afternoon, their armor caked in dried blood and sweat. Dehydration tore at their throats. Blisters ruptured inside their leather sandals. Every step was a battle against muscle failure and the overwhelming urge to collapse into the dirt. They marched through the afternoon, pushing themselves into a trance-like state of pure willpower. As the sun began to dip low over the Aegean, the vanguard of the exhausted Athenian army finally dragged themselves up the rocky slopes overlooking the Bay of Phaleron. Down below, the massive Persian armada was just beginning to drop anchor, preparing to unload their cavalry onto the undefended beaches of Athens. But as the Persian commanders looked up toward the heights of the city, they froze. Standing silently on the ridgeline, the fading sunlight glaring off their battered bronze shields, were the exact same madmen who had just slaughtered them on the beach. The Athenian army had beaten the ships. The Persians stared up at the silent, unbroken wall of bronze. The empire blinked. Slowly, the heavy transport ships raised their anchors and turned their prows back toward the open sea. The myth of Persian invincibility was permanently shattered, carving a new era of Western defiance out of pure, exhausted resolve.